and so it is. Gotta get a drink of water here and we'll get going. So I want to thank everyone for being with us today. I don't know how far we're going to get with this topic of happiness today. It is much bigger than a bread box. But we'll just see where it goes, and if we need to continue for another week or so, we will. It's kind of funny how things serendipitously seem to organize themselves, come back together, and be pointing in a direction. A movie that I really enjoyed is called They Might Be Giants, and it was George C. Scott and Joanne Woodward. And George C. Scott was a retired New York judge, and a wealthy one at that. And his family was trying to have him declared mentally incompetent so they could get his hands on the money. You know, the typical drama scenario. You know. And the reason they wanted to have him declared incompetent was that he acted as if he were Sherlock Holmes. He dressed the part. He had the deer slayer cap, and he had the shawl and the cloak, you know, and the magnifying glass and the pipe. And he went around and he saw clues in everything. So when the family petitioned to have him declared incompetent, the courts appointed a psychologist, who is Joanne Woodward, to go and evaluate him. And her name was Dr. Watson. And there you have the beginning of the movie. And all throughout the movie, they're traveling the streets of New York, and George C. Scott would just see a little scrap of paper on the street, and it blows by, and he says, "That's a clue, that's a clue." And he has to follow it, and he has to run, and he has to chase it, you know. And the whole time you're just kind of wondering, is he insane? Or is he seeing something there that no one else sees? And I think sometimes my life is kind of like that. Things pop up and they seem random. They seem, you know, they just appear. And then all of a sudden they seem to come together and point to something, like they were clues, like it was in fact a puzzle. But of course, something's on my mind and I'm just aware of these things, I'm sure, but it's an interesting way to look at life. So one of these things that's been rolling around for a while now is, it's got a couple of aspects to it. One is my realization of the inadequacy of words, in general, not just in my limited education, my limited vocabulary, but in general, how inadequate words are to express things. And yet we use them because they're the only tool that we have. So last month, our Zoom discussion group watched some episodes of Meeting of Minds, a great series, I think it's great, by Steve Allen, in which he brought together different characters from different times in history, and they engaged in a conversation on different topics of the day, you know. And one of them was Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, and he kind of, his kind of claim to fame was he analyzed how power worked. Not how it should work, but how it did work. And Steve Allen asked the character, the actor who's portraying Machiavelli, they all sat in character in costume, and he said, Machiavelli, you've said that people really can't resolve issues because they don't understand the words. And Machiavelli said, yes, that's right. He said, people go into this great discussion and this great argument, but they never define what it is that they're talking about. And if you don't know, if you don't have a definition, if you don't have a starting place, an agreement of what you're even talking about, how can you possibly reach resolution, you know? And I just smiled because certainly that's been my experience in life, in working in business and working in a role, you know, trying to help an organization grow and coach executives and things like that. Is so many times people just go off and they don't know what the other person said, but it pushed a button and they want to respond, and it's just people arguing back and forth. One amusing anecdote, and I know I've shared this before, but it kind of illustrates the point, is when I was working in New York City, in lower Manhattan, the lower west side of Manhattan, right down next to where the trade centers were built, we used to go over to a little restaurant for lunch, and it was a short order restaurant. They had a little lunch counter there, a little small steam table. You could get sandwiches and things like that. And they had a few tables, and they had a big long bar, and people would get a sandwich and get a beer and or a Coke or whatever, and go to a table or stay at the bar, have their lunch and then go back to work. And one day this great commotion broke out. And usually there's this din of people talking and all this going on. All of a sudden, everybody got quiet. Everybody just hushed to see what in the world was going on. And two of the employees who worked there in the restaurant had gotten into an argument. And one was a short order cook, and he was behind the counter, and he's waving a carving knife. And the other was a busboy, and the busboy is out cleaning the tables, and he's in this argument with the short order cook, and he's waving a wet rag. And my first thought is you don't ever want to bring a wet rag to a knife fight. That's just doesn't make any sense. But the two of them are arguing back and forth, and the one fellow yells something, and he's emotional, and his veins are busting out of his head, and he stops, and the other guy yells back at him, and they're just really getting into this, being angry at one another. And then all of a sudden, everybody in the place started laughing, and the two men were trying to figure out, why is everybody laughing? Well, one guy was yelling in Chinese, and the other guy was yelling in Spanish. They were from two different countries, from two different cultures, and when they got angry, they went back to their native language. Neither one knew what the other was saying. But they knew that they were mad at each other, and they knew that they were angry. And to me, that's just the epitome of what we're talking about here. Is they had no idea what the words meant. But they were upset by them. They were upset by them. So trying to find words to express what we mean, and trying to understand how other people are using words when they express themselves, it really takes a lot of work. It really does take a lot of effort. One of the things that we used to teach in clarifying communications was to stop and ask. Don't assume that you know what the other person means, but just stop and ask. Well, when you use this word, this is what I think it means. Is that what you mean by it? And just doing that little simple thing of training our customer service agents when working with the customers to clarify what the customer was trying to say, and not assume that they knew what the customer said. Just that one little technique, really helped improve our customer relations. So some of the words that have been rolling around in the different things that I've been reading are joy and happiness. And what is joy and what is happiness? And many times we use the two interchangeably. What is pleasure? What is joy? What is happiness? What do we even mean by those things? What are feelings? What are emotions? Some people say, well, they're exactly the same thing. Other people say, no, they're entirely two different things. So this idea then of what is happiness? What does happiness really mean? Years ago, I had read a book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it today, by the Dalai Lama, and it was on the art of happiness. But what is happiness? What do we mean by happiness? So last week we were watching TV. Lori and I were watching TV, and a music video came on, like from MTV from years ago. And it was Pharrell Williams, and he was singing his song "Happy." And you probably remember it as a lively little tune. And, everybody would sing it, and everybody would be smiling and everything. And there's a line in there that says, "I'm as happy as a room without a roof." And I'm thinking to myself, what in the world does a room without a roof have to do with being happy? What does that mean? But he sings it and he dances it and everybody smiles as if we actually understood what being as happy as a room without a roof is. So this kind of put me on my quest of doing some more reading, doing some more research. What is happiness? What do we mean by happiness? But in the context of our spiritual growth, not just, if you want to call it, secular happiness or human happiness or pragmatic happiness, but happiness along the spiritual path. That's kind of where I'm going today. But I wanted you to know how I got here. It was a kind of serendipitous path. Now, the first thing that we have to do is and we're going to come to this a little bit, is what is even the definition of happiness? Is there a definition of happiness? Do we have a right to try to be happy? Is that something that we even should or shouldn't do? And if we can come to some understanding of the definition of happiness that will be used along the spiritual path, then a question will become, well, how do we cultivate that? What could or should or do we need to do in order to experience this thing called happiness? So one of the first things that come to when I started to research, what the philosophers over the years have said is there's no agreement. There's no agreement on what happiness is. And they agree that there's no agreement. That's the interesting thing. They say, well, it's obscure, it's nebulous. We don't know what that is. And it just brought to mind that in the Declaration of Independence, we are told that we have a God-given right to pursue happiness. We're to pursue happiness, but there's no guarantee that you will be happy. Nor could there be, I guess, a guarantee that we could be happy, because it's so different for everyone, So some people think happiness might be a certain type of meal, or some people think happiness might be a certain type of book to read, or finishing a good book, or watching a good movie, or being in the presence of someone they love, and all of these different ideas of happiness.
Someone is at the front door.
Sorry about that. So the philosophers have said, well, there's no universal definition of happiness. So therefore, happiness cannot be a motivation in itself. They call it the greater good, the greatest good, Can our desire to be happy, can happiness be something that we would say we want to use or be aware of as a motivating force in our lives? And the philosophers would say, well, you can't do that because it's so different for everybody. How could you possibly say that the desire to be happy is the ultimate motivating force, the ultimate force? So it's sometimes we do things in order to get to something else. And it's that something else, it is that last resolution to something else. And we say, well, that is the ultimate. That is why we are trying to do that. And the philosophers argue and they say, well, it can't be happiness, you see, because happiness is so different that it just can't be a universal drive or a universal motivation. And I read that and I thought, well, I need to go back now and look at the Dalai Lama's book that I read, because the Dalai Lama says, the purpose of life is happiness. The purpose of life is happiness. What motivates people? He was asked, what motivates people? And he said, the desire to be happy. It is a basic human desire. Human beings want to be happy. But the method that they go about, the way that they go about being happy, two things about it is it might be different for everybody, but it is that ultimate happiness that they're seeking for that is the universal desire. And the second thing is that in our pursuit of happiness, in our drive to be happy, sometimes we do things that make us unhappy. They make us unhappy. So you can see how it keeps growing. This topic just keeps growing, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we have to come to this realization, or this first idea is, what is happiness, and do we have a right to desire to be happy? And here again, the philosophers weigh in, and I think it's Kant who said that no, we should not pursue happiness. Happiness is not to be pursued. Happiness is a consequence. Happiness is a side effect. Happiness is something that comes to us, and this is Kant's words, that comes to us when we fulfill our duty. See? And only if we fulfill our duty will we be happy. But we shouldn't do our duty in an expectation of happiness, because then that wouldn't be doing duty for our duty's sake, but we would be doing it out of a selfish motive of being happy. I'm going to be good so I can be happy. Don't want to be good because I really want to be good. I want to be good because of the reward of being happy is the best that I can make out of his definition. And I kind of looked at that and I scratched my head and I said, well, you know, I certainly respect his opinion, but why is duty the thing that should be our motivation? So I looked a little bit further, and he even went so far to say as the desire for personal happiness is immoral. Now I remember kind of getting some of this as a kid growing up, that that wanting to be happy was selfish, and we shouldn't want to be happy, because that was an outpicturing of our selfishness. But I had to wrestle with that a little while as well. And it brought me to, so what Kant was saying was, we shouldn't want personal happiness, but we should want the same happiness for everyone. We should want for everyone to be happy. And then you run into the problem, well, if we want everyone to be happy, what if everybody's idea of happiness is different? And what if two people's ideas of happiness are in direct conflict with one another? How do we resolve all that? But nevertheless, what he said was, you know, personal happiness is we want something for ourselves that we don't want for everyone. I'm paraphrasing what I think he meant. And it reminded me of something that Emerson had said. And Emerson said, and again I'm paraphrasing to the best of my memory, Emerson said that if we pray for something in our lives and we don't want that same thing for everyone, then it's not a good prayer. He might have even said it's not a moral prayer. So the two philosophers are kind of saying something very similar there. And what I'm taking away from that is there is a selfish desire for happiness. Mine, me first. I'm going to get mine. I don't care whether you get yours or not, I'm going to get mine. And I don't care if I get mine at your expense, I'm still going to get mine. We understand that mindset. We have seen that mindset at work. It's still at work in our society today. But there's a more universal desire of happiness. Right? In that I recognize that all human beings are alike. This is something from the Dalai Lama. All human beings are alike in that we wish to be happy and we wish not to suffer. We wish to be happy and we wish not to suffer. And if we can recognize that and respect that within each and every person, you see, then we would ultimately understand that their desire for happiness and our desire for happiness are equally the same. And what I wish for myself, I wish for them. And what I wish for them, I wish for myself. So I would come back and say then that my interpretation of what I was told as a child about this desire to be happy being selfish, at least that was my understanding of what I was being told. It might not have been told that at all. It might have been something I misinterpreted. But there's nothing wrong with the desire for happiness. It is a basic human desire. How we go about attempting to fulfill that, see, we can attempt to fulfill it in a way that brings us unhappiness and brings others unhappiness. But it's not the basic impulse or the basic desire for happiness that is wrong. So we have to be able to accept then that we have the desire to be happy. And it's a good desire. Let me kind of expand on that just a little bit, right? So as human beings, we have a desire. And that desire serves as a motive force to get us to engage in something. And that something that we engage in could be good for us or could be not so good for us. That choice is ours. That choice is ours. But what we are trying to do is we are trying to satisfy that desire. We're trying to resolve that desire. So our body needs fluid. And we become aware of this desire called thirst. Now, thirst is a good desire. Thirst is telling us, hey, you have to take in some fluids here. You need to hydrate. At that moment, we have a choice to make. What am I going to drink? Well, we can drink water, which is good for us, right? Which replenishes our bodily fluids. Or we can drink something that's not so good for us. The choice is ours. The behavior that we engage in, that we choose to engage in to satisfy that desire, that's the part that we have to fill in, you see. This is why I think we're allowed to pursue happiness, but we're not guaranteed we're going to get it. So we can actually do things that we think are going to satisfy our desire, but ultimately lead to unhappiness down the road. This is what the Dalai Lama kind of equates to the difference between pleasure and happiness. Now, at this point, we have to stop and say that the definition of happiness that we're working with here, but this is only a temporary definition, but the definition of happiness is really a satisfaction of desires. And perfect happiness or perfect tranquility or ultimate happiness, well, that would be when all desires are fulfilled. When all desires are fulfilled. But at that level, the definition that we're working with is very much about wanting something outside of us and bringing it to us. And then the pleasure or the satisfaction we have of taking it, bringing it to us, we recognize that as happiness. So what the Dalai Lama is telling us then in his works on happiness is we in society, we human beings, we tend to confuse pleasure with happiness. So pleasure is temporary, pleasure is passing. Pleasure is that satisfaction of the desire. But it is not in itself what he would call true happiness, not what I will get into here in true happiness for our spiritual growth. Right? Because very often what happens is the thing that is the object of our pleasure becomes a cause of our suffering. Because of our suffering. Now, probably the best example I can think of for this is addiction. People become addicted, say, to a substance, for example. because of the pleasure that it brings when they engage or partake of the substance. The momentary pleasure lasts, for a very short period of time. But once people do that, then they begin to suffer. Physically, perhaps the effects of addiction. But mentally, where is the next hit coming from? What happens if they don't get it? Do they have to hoard it? And all of the other behaviors that we see around addiction, where the person's motivation in life becomes to secure their supply of whatever that is that they are addicted to. So what started out as a pursuit of pleasure became a cause of suffering. And what we want to consider then is there's a difference between pleasure and happiness. But as I started out saying, our society and our culture uses words interchangeably when perhaps they shouldn't be interchangeable. Society kind of confuses the two. So another thing that I learned as a child in religious training, we were taught one of the reasons that God created us, this is the catechism is taught to little children, was to be happy with God for eternity. You see, to be happy with God for eternity. And I remember the children in school having this conversation with the nuns. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean to be happy for eternity? And the explanation, as I remember it, was, well, in heaven, you see, in this place called heaven, anything that you would want is immediately available. Right there, completely fulfilled. And therefore, all of your wants are satisfied. And that was perfect happiness. Now that kind of ties in with the definition of, trying to think of who it came from. I think it came from Kant. The definition of happiness that he used was the satisfaction of all desires. All our wants are fulfilled. We're happy, and that's perfect happiness. But that is the human or the secular idea of happiness. And now what we want to do is we want to come and we want to bring this to a different level, a different understanding of happiness, so that we can then move forward with, but how do you do that? But how do you do that? So I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that this desire to be happy is kind of inherent in all of us. And if we choose to fulfill it in an appropriate way, it can lead us to a deeper experience of the divine. If we choose to fulfill it in an inappropriate way, it can lead us into pain and suffering. Emma Curtis Hopkins, in one of her books, the very first chapter, it starts with, there's good for me and I ought to have it. And she says that seeking our good is a basic drive of all life, whether it be a creature in the forest or whether it be a human being. Why does, I love the sunrise down there. We were talking earlier about being down at the beach. And I love the sunrise there because you can see tens of thousands of seabirds leaving their nests and heading out to sea. Why are they going out to sea? Well, they're seeking their good. That's where their food is. And they get up in the morning and they take to wing and they fly out overhead and they go out until they disappear over the horizon. And they are seeking the good that they expect is there waiting for them, you see. And then at night, when the sun goes down, they come back in by the tens of thousands and they pass back overhead and they go to wherever they nest. And Emma Curtis Hopkins says, we have to understand that this seeking of good is a basic drive, is a basic compulsion. It exists across all of life, across all sentient beings. But we have to name our good. See, we have to name our good. We can't just say, I want good. I want something good, as the kids would say. We have to name our good. We have to name our good. And today I'm suggesting that we name our good happiness. Happiness. That is what we are truly seeking. But not the secular definition of happiness, which is whenever I want something, it's there and it's fulfilled and I'm satisfied. But a different definition of happiness. A different definition of happiness. And this brings us into peace and tranquility and what the Buddhists would call equanimity. Equanimity. Now, if our entire view of happiness is based on the external, that I get what I want when I want it, and then I'm happy, you see, then we have to recognize that that'll never be fully satisfied. If we eat, we become hungry again. If we drink, we become thirsty again. And this is why if you're familiar with the New Testament, there's a passage in there that says if you drink the water that comes from this well, you'll get thirsty again. But if you drink the water that I have to give you, this is Jesus talking, you'll never be thirsty again. You'll never be thirsty again. Happiness in the human definition is transient and fleeting, and it comes and it goes. And if you get what you want, then you'll want something else. And if you get what you want, then you worry that somebody's going to take it from you. And suddenly that which made you happy makes you unhappy. Now you're concerned and you're worried and you're paranoid. And you can never have enough, One of the things in the human condition, one of the things that leads to our unhappiness is comparison. Just comparison, You read in the paper that some athlete just got a contract for tens of millions of dollars, and they're the highest paid athlete in that sport, and they're very, very happy. And then next year another athlete gets a contract making more than that. And then suddenly they're not happy. The first one, suddenly they want more. And you have to ask, if you're making tens of millions of dollars a year, what more do you really need? And it's not the more. It's not the more that's important to them. It is the comparison. It is the comparison. We start comparing ourselves to others, and it's the comparison that makes us unhappy. And where does this comparison take place? It takes place in our intellect. It takes place in our mind. So the true happiness now, this is why I think we have to distinguish between human secular happiness and true happiness. The true happiness then is a condition of mind, is a condition of mind. So the Dalai Lama says he believes that happiness is the basic motivation of human beings, and that happiness can be achieved by training the mind. And he goes on to say that his definition of mind is not what we tend to recognize here in the West as being thought and intellect, and being able to weigh and to analyze and to follow logic and reason. But by mind he takes in the totality of consciousness, right? Our head and our heart, our thought and our feeling. By training our mind, by training our thought, by training our feeling, by training our emotions, we can achieve this tranquility, this true tranquility, which is a calmness of the mind that is true happiness, because it wants nothing. Rather than having all our desires fulfilled, there is this other concept that says, We have everything we want. We have everything we need. Or as the 23rd Psalm says, the Lord shepherds me. I lack nothing. I lack nothing. It is this realization that I lack nothing. Augustine put it another way. He said, I ask nothing of thee, speaking to God, I ask nothing of thee, not even thy love. I only want thee. I only want thee. That kind of goes back to the concept of heaven, this idea of heaven that I was given as a child, that if we are in that divine presence, now in that theology it was, after you die you go to this place called heaven and you're in that divine presence. But when we are in that divine presence, when we are in the conscious realization of the presence and the experience of God, we lack nothing. We want nothing. We are at perfect peace. We are at perfect tranquility. We are in the experience of true happiness. Now, because of our background, our education, our experience, we would say, well, how can you be happy if you're in a world where things are just, as terrible as they are? Just read the news, just look in the paper, just look all around you. There's war, there's earthquakes, there's hurricanes, there's pain, there's suffering, and there's all of these things. So I want to take you to some symbolism, some imagery. Remember a couple weeks ago, we watched some interviews with Carl Jung, and Jung said, there are at least two parts of us that make up the total self. And he said the ego, the awareness part of us, the part that is aware, the intellect, the thought, the reason, all of those things, is only a part of the total self. And the ego can't know the total self, because that part of the self that functions subliminally or below the level of conscious awareness, it is real, it is there, it has beliefs, it is the prime driver in motivating us to do what we do. But the conscious mind can never know it directly. The conscious mind can only know it through the symbols that it presents. And this is his work on dreams and his book, Man and His Symbols. He's talking about, what are the symbols? What do these symbols mean? What are they trying to tell us? And if we can understand what the symbols mean and the symbols trying to tell us, we might have some idea of what's going on subliminally below our level of conscious awareness. In the book of Revelation, which is a book of symbols, by the way, I can't remember the exact figures, 46% seems to stick out, and I have no idea who figured this out or how. But the number 46% seems to stick in my mind, that is the percentage of what is contained in the Bible as we know it, the Old Testament and the New Testament, that it deals with things that occurred in dreams and visions. So that's almost half. See, that's almost half of what's in the Bible is something that came to someone in a dream or something that came to someone in a vision. And the book of Revelation starts off with John saying, I had a vision. I had a vision. So everything that follows is the symbolism of his vision, of his revelation, and is speaking to us in symbols and must be interpreted in symbols. And we don't understand the spiritual symbolism, right? The metaphysical symbolism of that culture of several thousand years ago from the Middle East. We don't have it. I have enough trouble understanding Shakespeare, and that was written in English in the 1600s. How do I understand the symbolism, see, of a different culture, of a different time, and a different place? So it can't be taken literally, but we can try to see what that symbolism says to us. What does the symbol say to us? So there's one scene, this one passage in the book of Revelation, And it says there was this throne, and the throne was in the middle of a lake that was as smooth as a mirror, as smooth as a mirror. And off to the side, there was a pit, and there was fire and brimstone in the pit, and there was the weeping and the wailing and the gnashing of teeth. The perfectly serene mind, right? That which we are seeking can only be found in that perfect serenity, that perfect tranquility. And everything within us that is unlike that perfect peace, that perfect tranquility, that perfect happiness, see, everything that is not like that must be cast aside. And if we do not let it go willingly, which we tend not to do, there will be weeping, there will be wailing, there will be gnashing of the teeth, there will be a struggle. You see, there will be a struggle as we have to let it go. If we look out at the ocean, we can see disturbances we call waves or ripples. Little ones are ripples, big ones are waves, and some are really big waves on the surface of the ocean. We see these things. But if you can imagine getting in a submarine, you know, like the Jacques Cousteau movies, and they get in that little tiny submarine and they go down thousands and thousands of feet, and they have to turn on these bright lights because there's no light down there. At the depths of the ocean, it's tranquil. Whatever's going on the surface has no effect on what's going on down below the surface. What we want to consider, what we want to kind of entertain as an idea, is that things happen in life. Disturbances happen in life. We may have a flat tire. We may have a car accident. We may go to the doctor and get bad news. All of these things happen, and these things can cause a disturbance, right? A moment or more of a disturbance in our equanimity, in our tranquility. But they don't have to have a disturbance at the depth of our being. They can come up and they can pass. This too shall pass. This too shall pass. I'm going to close here with just relating from Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl in his work, Man's Search for Meaning. And we're going to pick this up next week because there's a whole lot more to go into about what is this thing called happiness and how do we pursue it as part of our spiritual path. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl was writing about his time in Auschwitz. He was put there. His entire family was put there. Much of his family was executed, tortured and executed. He was a doctor, so he was allowed to live and kind of tend to other prisoners in the camp as best he could. Said some days he had 2 aspirin to share amongst 40 patients. And he fully expected that when his usefulness to the occupiers was over, that he too would be led to the gas chamber. Said he understood all that. He understood the misery. He understood the suffering. He understood how terrible the things were that were going on around him. But he made up his mind to be happy. And he survived, and he went on to found a school of psychotherapy called logotherapy. He said he could make up his mind to be as happy as he could be, living in the horrors of Auschwitz. So this type of happiness that we're talking about, this tranquility that exists beneath the surface of whatever's going on, this ability to experience this thing called happiness, total satisfaction of all wants, or contentment, which is lack of want, we have the ability to do that. The Dalai Lama would say we have the ability to do that by training our minds. Frankl would say we have the ability to do that by deciding to be happy. So next week we're going to pick it up. We're going to talk a little bit more about what this happiness is, why is it important for us on our spiritual growth, and how do we cultivate it. So I invite you this week to kind of follow the clues as they came to me if you so desire. But spin these ideas around in your mind. What does the word happiness mean to you? What do you think of when I say, what would it take to make you happy? Is there something that you think of? What is joy as opposed to happiness? What is pleasure as opposed to happiness and joy? Are they all the same thing? Do they come to us from the outside in, or do they come from the inside out? What is it that brings you unhappiness? What is it that makes you unhappy? When are you unhappy? All of these things fall into where we're going to pick up next week, which is awareness. See, awareness of our mental states, awareness of where we are on our journey. So we're going to pick it up next week. Everybody have a beautiful week. If you can, get out somewhere, where you find it to be peaceful. Get out somewhere in nature. Go watch the children play at the playground. That always puts a smile on my face. Ask yourself, what does it mean to be happy? And we'll pick it up next week. And so it is.